Hello, this is Pastor Paul Meitner from St. Paul's First Evangelical Lutheran Church here in North Hollywood, bringing to you the third installment of our study of Luther's Reformation. And today, what we're going to look at is how Luther really went from, this kind of obscure man to the monastery, which is a major life change. And we really have to understand this major life change in him, how he got to that point. We have to understand his mindset. We have to understand where he's from, his background, in order to truly understand how God is bringing this man to make this wonderful discovery or rediscovery of the gospel in the midst of the Middle Ages, amidst the system that pervaded the Middle Ages, and how massively difficult it was. Again, as one great Reformation scholar just said, the really amazing thing about Luther is that he was able to mentally, spiritually reach beyond the Middle Ages, back to historic Christianity, back to the Christianity proclaimed in the Bible, to really understand and to really have the great glory that we have of the Lutheran Reformation today. So let's get into it today. The first thing we need to start out with, there's a man by the name of Erik Erikson. He was a psychoanalyst in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And he did a lot of work with children, a lot of work with child psychology. I'm unfamiliar with him other than I think he was a respected psychoanalyst of children during this time. But he got it into himself to try to psychoanalyze the young Luther. And he tried to do so in a very popular book called Young Man Luther. And he tries to psychoanalyze Luther. And he comes up with the suggestion that the Lutheran Reformation is really born out of Luther's poor relationship with his father. Again, very much following the ideas of Sigmund Freud, and applying these concepts of psychoanalysis to Luther. Unfortunately, this is kind of a joke of a book in many ways, because first of all, it's always a bad idea to psychoanalyze somebody who's been dead for 500 years and you've never had any clinical time with. That's kind of a dangerous thing to try to psychoanalyze the dead. I think it's also foolish because he is very selective about his readings about Luther's relationship with his father. Yes, Luther did have a stern relationship with his father, and yes, his father was known to get angry with him, but which of our fathers is not? He also ignores all of the indications that Luther actually had a pretty warm relationship with his father for most of his life, and pretty typical for the day. So again, he cherry picks information and quotes of Luther, and reads into them his own psychoanalysis. This is a great example of reading your own biases into historical fact. Always a dangerous thing, always something to watch out for. Again, when you read history, you have to read people in history according to their own times, not trying to read our own present ideas into their actions. It's always bad history. But you also have, he's not alone, there's also the typical Catholic take on Luther, which basically says Luther succumbed to temptation. Luther succumbed, most specifically, Catholic historians have said Luther was a lusty guy, and Luther, really his rebellion comes out of his sexual frustration, and he wants to marry and he wants to have children, and so he wrecks the church on the basis of that. That I find a completely ludicrous for a number of reasons. Number one, the Catholic medieval hierarchy was no stranger to sexual sin, and apparently there's no problem, I guess, in being a hypocrite and having a mistress on the side or using prostitutes, as we saw last week. That's okay, as long as we just don't marry. So there's just a ridiculous. And second, I think that it is, frankly, just silly and ignoring Luther's actual arguments, ignoring Luther's actual spiritual condition. And by the way, it's not a condition unique to Luther. It's a condition that was well known in the Catholic Church, as we will see today when we get toward the end of our lesson today. If you want to say Luther was tempted, I don't think he was tempted in the way they said. He was not tempted in any libertine way. Luther was a solid Catholic. In a session later from now, we'll talk about Luther as a monk, and Luther was the ideal monk. Luther, if anybody could have gotten to heaven by his Catholic works, his Catholic obedience, it was Luther. Luther, as I've said before, was uber Catholic. He was committed son of the church, and it was not something that he really wanted to put aside. So where does that leave us? I think that the one thing that we can say about both of these flawed methods is they do have something right. We really do need to dig into Luther, but in a much more wide view of Luther. What was Luther's life like in the late Middle Ages? Where did he come from? What was his socioeconomic status? What were his circumstances? What was his education? His parents and family. What was the relationship that we know of them? His religion. How did Catholicism affect him? We have to look at all of these things, and then we can come up with a fairly good answer about how this will all work. Luther's story begins at a little town known as Eisleben in central Germany. Thuringia is what is technically known as. He is the son of Hans Luther or Luther. It depends on numerous spellings. Again, spelling was kind of all up in the air at this day. He receives his name because he's born on the festival of Saint Martin of Tours, February 10th, 1483. His mother, we'll see her in a second here, is Margareta Luther. You can't see her, my face is covering her, but you can see Luther's features both in father and mother. She is a Lindemann, and that's going to play an important role in Luther's life later. He is born in central Germany. Central Germany is known for its heavy forest, but also for its mining region. It's also known for its universities. Some of the older universities in Germany were located in Thuringia. Most notably was the University of Leipzig, University of Erfurt, and both of those are going to play a major role in Luther's life later down the road. But again, as we said before, he was baptized on the day of his birth. That's where he receives the name Martin. He's named Martin after Martin of Tours, a very common thing that we would find in those days. Well, that gives you some geography, and it gives you a little bit about his birth. But what does that all mean? Well, let's go to our next slide. Let's start with Papa Luther, Hans Luther. He was of peasant stock, so Luther comes from peasants. Now, peasant has a more technical meaning when we talk about the Middle Ages. A peasant is a person who is tied to the land. He works the land faithfully for protection from his lord. He receives his protection from his local lord. The local lord will protect him from bandits, protect him with some sense of law and order, in turn for him working the land, giving produce the land, being able to live off the land. Again, this was not a great wonderful way, but it worked. It was part of feudalism. But Luther's family apparently had higher aspirations. They did not want to always be peasants. And they did have one thing going for them. They were part of what's called an Erbzinsleute. That's a family group that held kind of communal ownership of a village and its neighboring lands. In other words, think of them a little bit like the German version of the Scottish clan system. It's not only in Scotland that you have this type of clan system, you also have it in Germany. But what makes it a little bit different in Germany is that it's not merely familial, it's not merely for protection, but it also is kind of based around agriculture. We have communal ownership of these lands, we will work them for. In other words, it gave them a little bit of bargaining power with their lord. It gave them a little bit more of standing. They were able to keep a little bit more profit. It was able to move them out of such a tied sharecropping type relationship in the Middle Ages to more of a middle class. I mean, I'm using that very loosely. It still wasn't good to be a peasant, but this was a better peasant than to be a peasant. They were moving up, and they were making strides with each generation. It's interesting, a lot of people talk about Americans as having this ethos of wanting better for your children than what you had, but that's not a uniquely American ideal. You find already in the Middle Ages, that's very much what most people are trying to do. They're trying to give their children a better life than they had for themselves. And little by little, slowly by slowly, generation by generation, they're working their way. And Hans Luther had two things going for him that greatly moved his family forward, almost a quantum leap forward from his ancestors. The first thing is that he took a gamble on copper mining, which paid off. If you look at this, this is the only known portrait we have of Luther's father. And that's, of course, him as an old man. And you can tell that he is a little bit well-to-do by how he's dressed. He has that nice fur collar that tells you he has some position and standing in his community. He's not a noble, but he has money. He's comfortable. He's not worried about where his next meal is coming from. But if you look at his face and his hands, this is a guy who has worked to get his position. This is not a man who was handed anything. This is a man who worked very hard. He took a gamble on copper mining. For a number of years in my early ministry, I was a pastor in Iron Mountain, Michigan. And for almost 80 years, big mines ran up in Iron Mountain and Norway, and a lot of mining stories are told. That is not an easy business to be in. It is boom or bust. You either hit or you don't hit, and profit can close a mine, profit margin can close a mine. This is a very, very boom or bust business, and he took a big gamble, not only with his life, but with his family's fortune to do this, and he seemed to have paid off. He, by later in life, is actually holding positions equivalent to mayor in his local town council. He's a man who is respected, a man who has worked hard, a man who has gained the admiration of his peers. The other thing he did very well, here's a picture of some mining, again, not the safest thing in the world, but the other thing he did real well, he married well. He married above his station. And here is a better picture of Luther's mother, Margareta, known as Hannah, to her family, to her close kin. His mother was a Lindemann, and her family were not peasants. They were not people who worked land. They had long since moved off the land. They were known as burghers. Now, burghers means that they were city dwellers. They had broken out of feudalism through a combination of trained and university education, and that's interesting. Luther's mother's side of the family had a history of university education. Luther's father did not. Luther's father is a self-made man pulling himself up by the bootstraps through industry. But Margareta Luther has moved up not only through industry, not only through trade, but also through education, which puts you in the right circles. Again, people talk about going to the right school today. That's nothing new. In the Middle Ages, if you went to the right school, if you got into the university school, if you got into the University of Erfurt and you're studying with the elector's son, you have an in. This was a big deal. It's ridiculous to have this idea that university education was only about advancing the mind. It was also about advancing your social status. And Luther's mother's family had done that. For instance, Luther's uncle on his mother's side was doctors. His uncle was the personal physician of Elector Frederick the Wise. We'll talk about him later. Number of lawyers, number of political advisors, and university professors were all related to Luther. And when you put these two things together, what was their hope for their firstborn son, Luther? Their hope was he would end up to be somebody like this. Now, this is a picture of Thomas More of England. Thomas More is interesting, has a very similar background to Luther in some ways, and it's kind of like, what would have happened if Luther would have gone the other way? You can kind of look at Thomas More rising to the position of High Chancellor of England. That's what their hope is. Their hope is that their son, because of his prowess in the school, because of his intelligence, because of his university education, will be a trusted counselor, a trusted lawyer, a trusted person of the nobility, and thus advance the family up even more rungs for the next generation. That is their plan for him. So if you want to think about Hans and Margareta Luther, I'm kind of romantic, and my wife and I like to watch this PBS series, Poldark, Ross Poldark and his wife Desdemelda. Again, it's very sappy and sentimental, but I think it gives you a good idea. Again, these are people in Cornwall, mining. You get a good sense if you watch the series, if you read the books, just how dangerous mining was, how small the profit margin could be, how big it could be as well, and just how important it was to move up and to bring comfort and to bring security to your family, to your community, to the next generation. If you want to get a good sense of the mindset of Hans and Margareta Luther, read the Poldark novels, or if you're lazy, watch the Poldark series on PBS. It's going to be far more exciting, I'm sure, than Hans and Margareta Luther's life was. But it gives you some background into the role of religion, the role of community, the role of mining in a community. And it gives you some idea of what it must have been like and what the mindset was for Hans and Margareta with their son, Martin. Now, Martin is their firstborn son, and Martin has a kind of a very interesting journey from birth to the University of Erfurt very quickly. He only lives in the town he's born in for about a year. And then they make a move to Mansfeld. Mansfeld is a little bit away, but it's closer to the mines. And my guess is that we don't know exactly why they moved, but my guess is that they moved because he wanted to be closer to his interests. He wanted to be closer to the mine, and it did pay off. They do well at Mansfeld. Mansfeld is where Luther first starts going to school. We'll talk about that in a moment. For Mansfeld, he does go to Magdeburg for a year. We're not exactly certain why he went to Magdeburg for a year. But I think the best explanation is that the school in Mansfeld was not quite up to snuff. Luther was doing very well, but they wanted him to move a step beyond that. They wanted him to perhaps clean up whatever was deficient in the thought of going to university. I think already at this moment in Luther's life, he's only about 14 years old. They're already thinking about the university. We gotta clean up perhaps his Latin. We have to clean up some other things that are deficient. Let's go to Magdeburg for a year and to study for a year. He finishes up his high school studies, if you will, at a place called Eisenach. Again, he's not living with his family in Eisenach. He's living with other people in Eisenach, the Schalbe family and the Cotta family. But he is getting a very good education there. And again, Luther's top of his class. Luther is a very popular student, a very devout student, but an extremely intelligent. All from his early days, he was recognized as having a first-class mind, and we can't ever forget that. Again, a lot of times we talk about the passion of Luther, and Luther certainly was a passionate man, but what you forget is just how absolutely brilliant this man was. And he could have gone into any field and he would have excelled, and we probably would know his name in other fields as well. But he was a tremendously gifted man academically. And finally, our story will end today at the University of Erfurt, where Luther gets his undergraduate, his bachelor's degree, and his master's degree before he enters into the monastery. And that's a very interesting story, and we'll get to that there. But let's start with Luther's home life. What was it like growing up for Luther? Well, a lot of times I had the picture of Luther's home life was a life where he basically lived in sheer terror all days of his life. People have said that, again, Erickson in his book, The Young Man Luther, makes a big point of this because he's cherry picking. Now, I don't doubt that Luther had stern discipline, and I don't doubt that there were things that they were very scared about. But Luther is a child of the Middle Ages, and the child of the Middle Ages means that there's two things specifically I think you have to think of. And when you think of those two things, the first thing is you think of daily life. I think life in the Middle Ages was not dull. It was not drudgery. There was dancing. There was all kinds of activity from day in to day out. Luther's mother was very industrious. Luther, from little on, is very involved with his parents, grew up very close to his parents. Again, he's not rich enough to be sent off to boarding school as they would do not until he's older anyway. So he grew up in his mother's house. We're told that, yes, things could be stern in the mother's house, but also things could be quite fun. If you read about social life in the late Middle Ages, it is quite colorful and quite interesting. There are a number of Reformation scholars who really emphasize this aspect of life. One of my personal favorites is Hermann Sasse and Heiko Obermann. Both give you an insight into the intellectual development, but also the social development of Martin Luther during this time. And you'll find that Luther had a good sense of humor. One thing throughout Luther's life is he wasn't afraid to tell a joke, sometimes little coarse jokes. Luther had colorful language. Luther grew up, a middle-class kid, lower middle-class kid, and he never quite lost the laughter, the joie de vivre of life that he had. I think it's a mistake to think of Luther as this cowering, paling, sickly kid in a corner. That's not the picture I get of a young Luther. He had a very interesting, loving family, lots of activity going around. Father works very hard, mother works very hard, very frugal, try to save a lot, try to work hard. But again, it's an active and busy life. It's not a life of luxury or leisure, but a life of warmth and hard work. The other thing is that this is still the late Middle Ages. People still see the demon and the devil around every corner. There's a wonderful story about Luther's mother, Hannah. Hannah when Luther was sick, um, um, Hannah was um, going to come to him, and Hannah said that it was the neighbor woman put a curse on Luther, and with that, it gives you an aspect of people really believe there were demons and devils. Now, I do believe the devil is active. I do believe that Satan is a real person, that Satan does tempt. Of course, I believe that. But they believed it in a much more literal sense, that when the cow got sick, there was a curse, or when there was, there's a devil or a demon behind every shadow. Halloween for them was not fun; it was deadly serious. And so you have that activity, and the only defense against that is the church. And so Luther grew up very devout. Luther grew up very much to try to save and try to um, take care of these things. So Luther grew up going to Mass every Sunday. He grew up making sure he was confirmed. He grew up going to church. All of these things are very important. I would be remiss if I didn't mention, there's again these devils, these demons, but I would be remiss to say that he did get disciplined pretty heavily. He tells one story of one time he stole a nut from his mother's table in the kitchen, and he was, beaten until blood flew by his mother for stealing that nut. So there was stick. Now, again, we as modern people are that's child abuse. But that was typical for people back then. And I'll be honest with you, I'm still the last generation of kids in this country who's told corporal punishment in school. It isn't so weird for me. I remember as a little boy, being spanked by my teacher, and it was no big deal. This was an age where spoil, spare the rod, you spoil the child. So it was hard by our standards, but we have to be careful not to read too much into that. That was typical for them. And the other thing I want to stress is that there was a happy family life. I don't get the sense, he is very respectful and very caring of his parents throughout his whole life. He has a very warm and good relationship to his parents the whole life through. So I think that's something that you have to keep in mind, that he doesn't grow up as this kid who is cowering in a corner, terrified. I think that that's always there, but that's there for everybody. Again, I think you can't take Luther's experience apart from the context of the late Middle Ages. And you'll find that I think Luther's attitudes were similar to just about everybody else of his day. Again, Luther doesn't stand out as a person who is overly religious at this time in his life, nor are his experiences that different from any time in his life. I think we, living in our time, want to read that into it because it's so different from our experience. But we have to be careful not to do that. This was not a strange thing for Luther. Now, Luther's schooling. Luther started school pretty early. Luther started school, perhaps he was only 4.5 years old, about kindergarten age. We think people started school later back then, but Luther started about 4.5. The reason we say that is because he does remember his first day of school, or at least he says he does, and he remembers being carried there. The school couldn't have been more than a mile away, and so for him to be carried there, he had to be pretty little. To be carried there to walk that far. And so my guess is that he's about 4.5 years old. His school is a little different than our school. There's no finger painting at Luther's school. There's no recess at Luther's school. Luther's school was a school where they taught the trivium and the grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Now, this is an interesting thing to keep in mind about Luther's education and Luther's school. They had an idea in the Middle Ages, and I think it's very useful. In fact, there are many classical educated schools today in this country who have brought this back to life. They think that before I teach you about anything, I should teach you how to think. I should teach you how the mind works, how thought works. And so the focus was grammar, logic, and rhetoric, okay? Thinking correctly, writing correctly, speaking correctly. And especially in Latin. Latin is still a living language at Luther's time. Latin still is something that Luther has to deal with. So what we have is there are 3 basic divisions in school. If you want to think of them as, grade school, junior high, high school, you can. I don't know if they match up as well. But you had 3 Haufen, or 3 sections. When Luther starts school, his first is known as the Tabulisten, the beginners, basically ABCs. Latin vocabulary, Latin prayers, Latin liturgy of the church, and all by repetition. So 3 times a day, you went through everything by repetition. I'll tell you a story about that in a minute, but it's very boring, but pain keeps it alive. We'll talk about that in a minute. The whole point of this is that you needed to be able to think, speak, and read in Latin. Latin was the lingua franca of Europe at that time. It didn't matter where you were from. It didn't matter if you were German or English or French or Italian. When the language of communication was Latin. It's interesting, even to this day, the official language of the Vatican is still Latin. So all the papal encyclicals are still done in Latin. Interesting, where I went to school, Martin Luther College, its predecessor, Northwestern, still had as a requirement for the valedictorian and the salutatorian a Latin oration as part of the graduation. You were still considered, Latin was still in some little bit taught and expected to be not only read but spoken, because that was the language of the people. So even into the 20th century, you still have some aspects of that in that. So you had to learn Latin, and you went through vocabulary 3 times a day, the ABCs, how you put together, sentences, what's the subject, what's the verb, things like that. As you got older, you moved into the Donatisten, and that's named after the textbook that was used, known as the Donat, or the gift. That you studied grammar and syntax. You began to diagram sentences, as I used to do in grade school. How does language work? What is a prepositional phrase? What is a participle? What's a gerund? How do these things work? What are they doing? And then how do you decline it? Most Americans don't realize how complicated Latin is. And Latin, by the way, is very simple compared to Greek. But Latin is, you have to decline verbs. You have to conjugate, decline nouns, conjugate verbs. There are, dozens of different forms for every verb, and you have to know how to make them and how to read them. And then you have active voice and passive voice and things like that. It's quite worried. The interesting thing here, though, and this does pop one of the problems that I think people early have, is that people said Luther never read a Bible till he got into the monastery. That's not completely true. They did read sections of the Latin Vulgate, which is still the official translation of the Roman Catholic Church. They did read the Psalms. One of the most interesting things about Luther is Melanchthon, Luther's colleague at Wittenberg, says that Luther most likely had the entire Bible memorized. And how could you do that? But if you study people at this time, this is one of the things that amazes me about the Middle Ages, and in some ways makes me long to bring some of this teaching back, is they were taught a method of memorizing where people could memorize entire books. People were taught what was known as the memory palace. I still try to use the memory palace myself, but where you're able to use this technique to memorize hundreds and hundreds of things. And you can memorize entire books, entire passages. Luther most likely had the entire Bible memorized, not only in Latin, but certainly in German and also in Greek. It shows, if you ever read his writing, as a command of the Bible. But not only interesting a command of the Bible, he has a command of writers like Aristotle, Cicero, the traditional people. And then the final stage of his education before he goes into university is known as the Alexandristen, again named after the textbook of a famous French grammar teacher. And there you got really advanced Latin grammar, but that you all started reading classical authors. Remember that in the Middle Ages, philosophy and theology are pretty much the same thing. So you read a lot of literature, but a lot of philosophy and a lot of theology, and you start reading those things. Now, in addition to that, you also studied things like mathematics. You studied things like you studied things like music. You got to know the liturgy very well. Began understanding a few things about the law. Again, it's a very well-rounded education, but the basis of that education is the trivium, which is the grammar, logic, rhetoric, so that when you get to the university, you are ready to think, you're ready to discuss, you're ready to debate. That's the big thing that people are looking to do. The funny story I wanted to tell you about is how did they motivate kids when things were boring? Well, they motivate them 2 ways. The first way is that if you got things really wrong, you got to be the asinus, which is the donkey, and you got to be sitting in front of class. They were not afraid to mock you if you got something wrong and to laugh at you. They motivated by shame. And if motivating by shame didn't work, they motivated also by punishment. One student was kind of the underground informer. He was known as the lupus. And if during the day you lapsed into German instead of speaking all Latin like you were supposed to, remember this is language by immersion, you'd get a mark on the board. If you declined something wrong, you got a mark on the board. And at the end of the week, how many ever check marks you had, you got that many beatings with the cane. Not a fun way to learn, but that's what they did. They did that way, and people learned. And again, we kind of consider these practices barbaric, cruel. Again, I don't know that they considered it that much, but they did. And Luther was common. Luther, by the time he gets to the end, does not the asinus or the lupus. He's quite smart, right, standing above his classmates. He spends 1 year in Magdeburg at what's known as the Brethren of the Common Life. This is kind of a semi-monastic, semi-religious order that was dedicated to education. And again, my belief is that he is brought here primarily to brush up what he's not. Magdeburg is still kind of a backwater. Mansfeld is still a little bit of backwater. His church Latin is not as good, which will show in his Latin writings later. I think he goes to Magdeburg primarily to get brushed up, get up to snuff. Going to this school. He's only there a year, but there's a couple things that happen while he's here during that year. I think he really does see something that's going to dawn on him later. But the way the Brethren of the Common Life focus on education, but where they have this calling, education is important for the whole spiritual life of the student. And again, I think he sees that. The other thing he sees is this thing. Now, this is an emaciated beggar by the side of the road. But this was quite a common thing you would see in the Middle Ages. But these people are begging not because of drug abuse or anything like that. These people have renounced. And the one memory he has, very vivid memory he has from Magdeburg, is a Prince William of Anhalt, a nobleman, renounced all of his possessions, renounced his title, and gave himself to begging and for the church, and to devote his life to prayer and meditation. And he remembers vividly this emaciated nobleman and how much he must love God. And that sticks, wow, that man really loves God, that he would give up his power, he would give up his position, he would give up his, that man, he must go right into heaven. And this really leaves an impact on him. And that will play an important part later. But this image of this emaciated Prince William of Anhalt really leaves a lasting impression upon what it means to be devoted, what it means to be a true good Catholic. That's the standard by which we can all measure, and it sticks in his head. And we'll see why it comes to the fore later. The other thing I think it's interesting is that it's probably the first time he comes into contact with a really good library. Again, this idea that books weren't common. Books were common, but they weren't as widespread, and not everybody read. But here in Magdeburg, you had a very excellent library, and most certainly he read quite a bit. But here is what a medieval library would look like. There were books, you would set them out. You didn't check books out. They're too valuable to trust somebody to take them. And so you read them there. It's interesting also that reading, and this is why memorization was so important, because you couldn't check a book out. You memorized as you read, in very common ways, and that when you read out loud. You read very much memorizing as you read. You would go back to it, of course. But in the debate with Luther and Eck many years later, Luther's phenomenal memory, his ability to quote church fathers, ability to quote things, just shows you just how great his memory was and how much he would committed to memory. But again, you had access to the book, access to knowledge there. But again, he probably read the Bible already here. Again, I just wanted to dispel this rumor that he never read the Bible. He read certainly sections of the Bible, but he never read the Bible with evangelical eyes until much later. But he had access to a Bible, certainly at Magdeburg. Luther at Eisenach. Luther refers to this part of his childhood as probably his happiest. This is actually the house Luther lived in while he was in Eisenach. He lived with the Cotta family. He's known at this time for his music. Luther was very gifted musically, as will play itself out. He played the lute. He was known to sing for his supper, and he was quite a good voice. He also sang in the local choir, sang in the church choir, participated in the mass. as an altar boy, things like that. But he is known as a very, very happy time. He really enjoyed school in Eisenach. It's probably the happiest time of his young life. He is very close to the Cotta family, Frau Cotta, almost like a second mother to him, very close to him. And then he comes into contact with the Schalbe family as well. And the Schalbe family, he doesn't live with them, but we're saying he ate with them in the sense that he was always over at their house. He was kind of like the kid who always hung on. And the Schalbe family really left an impact on him because the Schalbe family was very devout. My take is they were probably more devout than Luther's own parents, in the sense that not only they did what was required of them, but they really took it seriously. So it's the difference between a person who goes to church because it's the social thing to do, and those who really believe it. The head of the Schalbe family, he supported the local monastery. He was a very generous giver to local religious causes. A man who really took that vocation. This is something that will come up in Luther's life later, but the idea of vocation he begins to see. And again, Luther's exposed to these religious things. Right now, they haven't really come to the fore, but it's there. Again, this devotion to his studies. By the time Luther ends his studies at Eisenach, he is he's earmarked for something great. He's a brilliant guy, and he is ready for the university. And that brings Luther to Erfurt. Now, Erfurt is one of the leading towns of central Germany, and also is one of the older universities in Germany at that time. Founded in 1392, I think. You'll have to check me on that date, but the late 14th century it's founded. It is one of the leading universities in Germany, one of the most respected. It's also known as an extremely religious city. There are dozens and dozens of religious houses, monasteries, and such. At the university, we shouldn't think of the university as laid out like our modern universities that it has its own campus. Rather, it's spread out between different houses that are teaching different things. And the three things basically you went to university for: the law, medicine, or theology. Now, Luther, of course, is going for the law. And Luther gets his bachelor's degree in quite a short amount of time, less than 3 years. He's able to master. He is the second leading student in his class. He is marked by a number of his professors as extremely brilliant and does very well. Again, I want to say that we shouldn't think of the university experience for Luther as like going to USC. I think that would be a mistake. Luther didn't go to Keggers, and there was not football, and there were things like that. Those are modern devolution, in my opinion, of the university system. Luther's experience at the university was much more like my experience at Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary. Very regulated. You had chapel. You were expected to go to mass. You had times of prayer. You had a number of a huge workload from morning to night. One of the things I always joke at is I always laugh at people when they're getting their master's degree or things like that, and they complain about the workload. The workload that you get for a master's degree in any university is nothing compared to the workload that was expected of me in my seminary education. Just not even close. It's almost a joke even to compare the two. I'm not saying that in a boasting. I'm saying that the amount of writing and reading and class time I spent in the seminary was extremely regulated and extremely heavy. I would say, I'm just saying that to say Luther's university experience was closer to that than it is to the modern master's program or the modern bachelor program. Luther didn't have a lot of free time. Luther was working. Now, I don't want to give the impression that just because it was very regulated that Luther didn't have a good time. Luther did. Luther was a man who was quite popular. I just want to point this out by saying, if I had to picture Luther at the university, really up until the time he gets his BA and into the time he's getting his master's degree, Luther's the life of the party. Luther he's at the top of his game, which is good. Luther is known for his brilliance in class, his brilliance in especially rhetoric. Luther is a great speaker. We're told Luther had these great eyes that just kind of power through you. In Luther's mind, he's quick on his feet. Luther is earmarked, but Luther also has lots of friends. He has good friends. He laughs. He drinks. The story told before he goes into the monastery, he holds a huge party before he goes into the monastery, and he gives away all his earthly possessions before he goes to the monastery. But again, it's like the one last final time. But you get the impression that Luther was like that. Luther was a jovial person, a person who loved life, loved to tell jokes, a good guy. And so, Luther really this is where he's aimed for. He's aimed to be the guy. He's aimed to be the man. He's aimed to be the Thomas More of Germany, of Saxony, of some local prince or magnate. He's on that fast track to that. And then suddenly he makes a sharp 180 that completely throws his parents, his friends, everybody through a loop. And this is one thing I want to stress to you. Luther is not the morose, overly religious guy. He was religious by the standards of his day. He was religious in the sense that everybody in the Middle Ages was religious, as we talked about. But he was not overtly religious. He had religious experience, seeing Prince William of Anhalt and seeing the Schalbe family. He had those experiences. He went to Mass. He grew up in the medieval sacramental system. He understood that. But he doesn't have really any indication he's going that way until a sharp turn. And one thing I want to stress is sharp. It's not as sharp as people make it. It's not like he made a snap decision. But over a period of months, he goes from a person who's aiming for Thomas More and ending up Bernard of Clairvaux. And how does that happen? Well, I want to talk about Anfechtung. Now, Anfechtung is a German word, and there is no good English equivalent to that German word, but distress, storm of the soul. As Kierkegaard would put it, fear and trembling. And a couple things happen. The first thing happens is he has a good friend about the same age who dies of plague. Dies very suddenly, very quickly. And that he could get struck down that quickly in life, Luther is taken back by that. And again, remember, this is the age of the dance macabre. This is the age of where death is very prevalent. And that makes him a little bit worried. It's brought even closer to home through a funny story. Luther apparently wore a sword, partially for personal protection, I guess. But he's not very good with the sword. Luther is not very coordinated. And Luther has an accident, falls off his horse and stabs himself in the leg. And Luther said he would have died had there not been a physician nearby to stop the bleeding, put a tourniquet on, and heal him. During that stabbing incident, he beseeches Mary, the Mother of God, to save him. And he really believes that Mary saves him. And that, I'm saved, I'm not going to die. And that shakes him. So you have these two things, the death of a loved one. Now he came close to death. And the final thing that shakes him, of course, most of you are familiar with his lightning bolt experience. He was walking home. I think he was going home on break. He had just completed his master's degree. He's going to start his law degree program, if you will. And he's really, really worried. He's going to talk to his father and mother about this. And then on the way home, lightning strikes near him. He prays to Saint Anne to forgive him. He survives. He says, I'll become a monk. And what I want to get is this is a building crisis of conscience. It's a building sense. And you have to keep in mind everything we've talked about. And now suddenly death, which had been put far away, he's been aiming for this life, this taking my parents up. Now that seems to be the wrong way. I'm going to die before God. God's sending me a message. He's talking to me directly. I better do something. And that terror is filling him, and he has to do something. Now, that terror is not all that new. I want to go back here. I went a little too far. Let me talk about Anfechtung. Temptation, trial, affliction. It's kind of a combination of those words. Temptation, it points that this is a period of testing by Satan. Luther really believes that Satan is after him. And that if he ignores these signs in his life, he is going to succumb to evil. He will not see the glory of heaven, and he's really scared. I've had this experience as a pastor many times with many different people who are not religious at all, but then something happens and they're scared to death and they want me at their bedside. It's happened right now during this pandemic. A lot more people are watching me. A lot more people are praying. A lot more people are tuning in because I think they're scared if they get this trial. That it's a probationary period of God. Through trial, God puts the Christian to test the sincerity of his faith. I'm on a test. Will I pass the test? Luther is saying. And then finally, affliction. There's really suffering or pain. It doesn't necessarily need to be physical, although it can be. But for Luther, it's a spiritual pain. Luther is terrified. Now, I agree with this. I've had a lot of physical pain in my life, but is nothing compared to a guilty conscience. And I think that Luther felt the guilt of his conscience, and there is nothing worse than a guilty conscience. And Luther, given the mindset of his day and given perhaps things he may have done as an undergraduate, he is filled with fear for his soul. And this is the Anfechtung. This is the distress that is terrifying. He can't hold on to it. And this is not something unique to Luther. I don't care what Catholic biographer says. It is something that is very common. In fact, it was common in Luther's day as well. Look at this. You have, this is one of my favorite novels. It was written by a man named Francis Nielsen, The Witness of St. Ansgar. It's a German Catholic parish in Brooklyn during the 1920s and 30s. And this is just one section from this. It's a conversation between a young altar boy and a lay or a Franciscan brother by the name of Benino. And he says this, it's a very old and serious sickness, Mario. Monks and priests and nuns can suffer from it. It goes back a long time. The conscience gets too fine, too finicky. Martin Luther suffered from it when he was a monk. They get no peace. They are filled with all kinds of doubt and guilt. It drives a person crazy. Everything they do is sinning. They have to run morning, noon, and night to confession. It's a terrible, awful sickness. Benino's word hung in the air. After a while, Mario asked, how does it happen? Benino spread his hands. I don't know how it happened, but all religious know about it. They know that it can destroy a person. Why don't they know they're not sinning? Their confessor tells them, but they pay no attention to it. It gets inside of them. Would you believe me if I told you that you walked with a stone in your shoe, if it were all in your head and it wasn't hurting, and your foot now, how it feel? Can you remember the pain? Can you imagine how it can be if they pebble in your conscience? Even St. Francis can't help one of his brethren who stays scrupulous. Friar Tommaso, St. Francis tries everything. He stays up with him at night. He ties him with ropes. He tells him that it's not possible for him to be sinning, but the friar says he is sinning in his mind, and his ears, his eyes, his lips. He says he has to leave the order. St. Francis begs him on his knees. He says, Tommaso, little sheep of Christ, stay. God will give you peace. But Tommaso run away. What happened to him? Benito dodged the question. Tommaso had hanged himself. He disappeared forever. Now, I think this gives you a good idea of the Catholic mindset, but it also shows you what's wrong with the Catholic mindset. Tommaso's right, and Luther's right. If God takes sin seriously, yes, I do sin in my mind. How do you think that God doesn't see a dirty thought in my head and say that's not a sin? See, the Catholics says it's only a sin. It's only really a sin if you act on it, and the Bible doesn't say that. And this is what Luther is getting at. This is what all these things that have happened abroad. No, I am sinning all the time. That's why God is warning me. That's why God's getting me. Now, the Catholic looks at Luther and says he's crazy. He's taking sin too seriously. And Luther said, no, I'm taking God seriously. I'm taking sin seriously. And we'll talk about that later. The hinges, as one teacher of mine has said, the hinges upon which the Reformation swings, that Luther took God's word seriously. God's angry with all sin, and God's word seriously. Other examples of this is an image I found when I was writing a paper on this, but here is a from the late 14th century, so the 1300s, from France, a pious monk who meditates upon the Psalter, but he misinterprets it. And he kills himself because he's so consumed with guilt. He's got to get rid of it. So this idea of Anfechtung is not new. It's not something unique to Luther. And as a pastor, I have dealt with it over and over again, not only in my own soul, but especially in the souls I ministered. So Luther's Anfechtung leaves him here on the road. And remember, you have this background of the medieval death. Death is always pulling at you. Death can take you at any time. You have the medieval background of there is a devil at every corner trying to hunt you down and pull you. On the back of that, you have the when hasten doom again, which is telling you, nam quod de estu facies tuum boum estu facere quod in se est. Do what is in you. Do what is in you. So you have this beast running you down, and the church is saying you better do what's in you. And what does that leave Luther? Well, here are the sacraments. There's a sacramental system. Well, he's done these. He's not married. He hasn't died yet, so he can't use those two things. The other four have brought him no comfort. He's been baptized. He's gone to confession. He's had Holy Communion. He's had confirmation. He's only more terrified. That only leaves one thing open for him. And this is the only thing left. So what does he say? I'll become a monk. And so he goes into the monastery. And so I think this gives you an idea of what drives Luther into the monastery. He's a very talented man, and a man that's very gifted, and a man headed places. But this Anfechtung, this taking his sin seriously, and God's angry, and what does the church say I should do with this? He takes it seriously. One of the things I have to stress to you, but there's two kinds of Catholics. There's Catholics who are cultural Catholics. Well, mom's Catholic, dad's Catholic, I go to mass. And then there's Catholics who really believe it. And Luther's a Catholic who really believes it and takes it as God's honest truth. And those people I always feel really bad for, because they are left in a state of next to terror, living always in despair. Even the Catholic Church recognized that. And what is the Catholic Church? Don't take it so seriously. Well, but you've told me to take it seriously. God's told me to take it seriously. And gives you some understanding of how Luther gets into the monastery. And in the monastery, we'll find that the hope and peace he found only gets worse. And we'll talk about that next time. But this is Pastor Meitner signing off. Thank you for joining us today for our third installment of this Bible study. And we will look forward to seeing you again. God bless your day.